You're welcome to Ignition Global. My name is Veronica, continuing with the Heritage series. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that has received, certainly in the British press, a lot of coverage, especially over the lockdown. And it's in relation to domestic abuse. Domestic abuse, domestic violence within the home or without the home. But I'm more interested in domestic abuse as it affects children. Oh yes, as it affects children. Up until the recent past, many people felt that if they didn't see it, if they didn't feel it, if they were not put in that proximity, it did not affect them. How wrong can we be? But thank goodness for research, thank goodness for painstaking study. Many have shown the effect, the devastating effect that domestic violence has on children, particularly after a very prolonged period of time. So what exactly is domestic abuse? It is any behavior that's controlling, that's threatening, and that's bullying, as well as violence between people in a relationship. Oh yes, you can see how that would affect a child. So it's a bullying behavior, those in the relationship, the adults in the relationship, or even siblings in the relationship. Violence, threatening behavior, and it is shown that it can cause serious harm to children and young ones. Oh yes, particularly if they witness it. Now, it has recently become to be considered that a child witnessing domestic abuse, domestic violence, actually constitutes to child abuse. This is the reason why, for instance, if social services are involved in a family, or it's come to the attention of social workers, that depending on the situation, obviously, they will insist that the perpetrator, that's the aggressor, the person that's causing the domestic abuse, domestic violence, is asked to leave the environment in order to secure the child, in order to save that environment for the child from continuing to witness it. And the perpetrator is given an opportunity to undertake some sort of courses, some sort of therapy, and where possible, rehabilitation takes place. If there's learning and he's been able to, or she's been able to demonstrate that there's been a change or a learned behavior. But the interest is always to secure the child per se. And sometimes unfortunately, where they're unable to make that change, the child is removed simply because it's considered abuse. Now, it can take place, the act can take place inside or outside. Yes. And it can take place over the phone. It can take place, where the victims are in social media circumstances, So it's like the social networking is also added to the mix, and also DA continues whether the relationship is subsisting or even after the relationship. So it's something that if people are interlocked in, it requires a lot of help, a lot of intervention to break that cycle. And, the law has been able to understand that the children that are exposed to this thing is called domestic abuse. Why? Because it causes great harm, great trauma to the children, which goes on right through to adulthood if there isn't sufficient intervention. So what does it look like? What exactly, what constitutes domestic abuse, domestic violence? It is as simple as hitting, kicking, punching, rape, threats to kill, threats to harm, threatening various members of the family. If the children are exposed to sort of environment, it can only cause battery of some sort to their lives. We know that children thrive on stability, equilibrium, and all those wonderful, peaceful environment. Stability, routine, boundaries, all those things. None of these are possible in an environment where there's war, physical or otherwise. This is the reason why it's so very important that if a parent finds themselves in that sort of environment, they need to seek help. There's a whole list of people that are prepared to provide the help. It need not necessarily be the case that once there's DA, the child is removed from your care. No. If the parents are prepared to work with professionals and get help, that is usually the best outcome. So the kicking, the biting, the threatening, and also it is about how the individual, not necessarily the perpetrator, how the effect of that act has on the child, the effect that it has on the individual, the recipient of such an act. What do I mean by that? So for instance, if the person makes a threat, it's how I perceive that threat. So the person need not necessarily hit me or kick me or do any of those terrible acts to me. A threat is enough, and it could be a threat over the phone. I talked about networking, social networking before. It could be over the telephone. It could be written by email, etc. All these things constitute DA, and every child has a right to be brought up in an environment that doesn't even have any of those things around, simply because it impedes their growth over a period of time. So we've established these the sort of things, threats and what have you. You might say to me, what if I'm joking, etc. But we all know what constitutes a threat and what isn't. The important thing is that if you find yourself or somebody that's in that sort of environment, the sooner they get some sort of help. Because if they don't, even though they may be the victim, the reality is that they become complicit in the actual DA. So they talk about that even though that person is a victim, they have failed to protect that child. And that's the reason why the child becomes an interest of the local authority, unfortunately. However, it is the best outcome for that child. And this is the reason why, if somebody is is locked up in that sort of relationship, they need to step aside and focus on the child. They need to take whatever decision, whatever action they can. If it's and the thing is, another difficult sort of belief is that it's always women that are the victims. DA can be domestic abuse could either be from the male or from the female. Admittedly, simply, in terms of statistics, there's no question that women tend to be a lot more, I guess because of size, they tend to be more of the victim. Does not mean that there are no female aggressors. We know some, but certainly you cannot compare in terms of the sexes. So there's no question. Certainly in my experience in the work that I do, it oftentimes have been the men that are the perpetrators. It doesn't mean, again, I don't want people telling me that what I'm saying is out of whatever, because it is not. On the whole, it tends to be men. People like to argue for things that are pretty much obvious. It's not a question of bashing anybody. It's a question of stating the facts. So if you find yourself, again, I'll say, or if you know people that are in that situation, there's no point pretending or turning a blind eye. Think about the child or think about the children and help. Don't say, oh, well, it's not my business. It is your business. If you're invested in that relationship by virtue of a family member or anything like that, or friend, close friend, get involved. Because if it's not dealt with on time, it gets worse if unchecked, and it has untold consequences, shall I say, in the sense that the children could be removed. And, also, the sooner that it's nipped in the bud, the better. Now, DA affects children in different ways, in different stages. How? We know that, for instance, a young child in the womb can physically be hit. The mother can be hit and the mother can fall. And we know studies again have shown that children learn as early as in the womb. Whatever mood, whatever is in the environment affects that child. So imagine a child in the tummy being subjected to domestic violence. And even as a baby, the child may fail to thrive over a period of time, and going on to being a toddler, they may have difficulties forming relationships, difficulty with attachments, all the way up to teenagehood, drug taking, risk taking, and what have you. So it affects them in different stages. Now, if you live with, or somebody or you live with somebody, what are the telltale signs? It obviously varies from child to child, but if a child is withdrawn, the children feel that they're unable to speak to anybody. They may start being depressed, high-level anxiety, inability to cope with stress. Schoolwork suffers, peer relationships are affected, a whole host of things. And you can see how these things don't bode well in terms of their learning, in terms of their outcomes. So if you find, of course, if you are the parent locked up in that, you don't even wait for the signs, you try and do something about it. But if people around, children around you are exhibiting some of these signs, it's probably a cry for help. These are the telltale signs that you can try and speak to them and find out how you can help. Most children wouldn't say anything simply because of the family relationship. But if you're fortunate enough to have a child speak to you and tell you about that, I think, I say fortunate enough because it's not something that would happen easily. So if that child opens up to you, well done for creating the environment that makes them feel safe enough to speak to you. But I think the important thing is to assure them that they are doing the right thing, that they are not being disloyal to family members, that they're doing the right thing, and that you're able to listen attentively, make notes, reassure the child that you would do something about it. Doing something about it, maybe speaking to, depending on, it may not always be a good idea to speak to the parents, depending on the severity and depending on the age of the child and depending on so many different variables. But if you're able to speak to the parents, probably a good idea. If it's not a good idea, as I say, sometimes it's not always a good idea, you need to go to the authorities. You need to speak to other family members to open it up. And it's not a thing to be ashamed of. At the end of the day, these things happen. Assure the child that the important thing is to see if you can get the child out of that environment as quick as possible. If there's a grandmother or a grandfather available, they probably need to get involved, etc. But also you have to also gauge the level of, if it's just threats that are being made, it's bad enough, but perhaps people will not be caught in the crossfire of being threatened. However, if the perpetrator is violent, there can be consequences and perhaps stricter measures and more difficulty and stringent measures needs to be. So it needs to be handled carefully. And I always say, absolutely pray for wisdom, but we need to move our feet to secure those children out from that environment to a place of safety. It may be a question of speaking to the mum or speaking to the dad, whoever's the perpetrator or the non-perpetrator. And if they're able to respond appropriately and protectively, then it may just end there. But the child that opens up to you is absolutely a bonus, because that child is asking for help. And hopefully, apart from listening, assuring the child that it's not absolutely their fault, nothing to do with them, there's nothing they could have done to have changed anything. It's entirely not their problem. It's not for them to try and mediate between the parents or between the caregivers. So you tell them that it's not their fault. You tell them that they're doing the right thing. You tell them that you will help and do whatever you can. And depending on the age of the child, you tell them what it is that you plan to do and follow it up. And by all means, you need to be careful because you were told a secret. I'm assuming it's a secret. So you've got to speak to the child depending on their age and understanding and reasoning and all the rest of it. But the important thing, as I said earlier, is to ensure the child is removed from that place. The removal may just be that it stops. i.e. you speak to one of the parents and they're able to get it together because it's not entrenched, so it just stopped. But if it's a question that something needs to happen, so be it, because the important thing is to safeguard the child. So that's just a little discussion on child abuse, or shall I say domestic violence, or on domestic violence, how it affects children. Let us be vigilant around us. Let us pray that these children are protected, and let's pray that help comes, because it's a reality in some homes, and it's unfortunate. Some homes, they're able to hide it for decades on end, and it's only when the child comes out or they come to the attention of the local authority that you begin to hear that certain things have happened. So we pray that children are able to get help, and at the worst case scenario, at the end of that, there's the law. The law is there to protect families. It's not an ideal way to settle things, because I always feel that it's something that families themselves should be able to come, but it's not always possible. And where it's not possible, I pray that the people have the sufficient strength to do what needs to be done, because at the end of the day, it is to safeguard the children and keep them away from witnessing domestic abuse or domestic violence. That's all on this podcast, and I hope to speak to you and see you soon. God bless you, and let's look after ourselves, particularly the children. Bye.